There are moments in football when the game itself almost becomes secondary. Moments when the goals, the trophies, and even the World Cup matches are temporarily overshadowed by something much bigger. Questions of power, questions of leadership, questions about who actually protects the values football claims to represent. And on a remarkable week in June 2026, those questions exploded into public view. Because while the world was watching the biggest tournament on Earth, another story was unfolding behind the scenes. A story of tension, a story of growing resistance, a story of institutions across Europe increasingly signaling that they are deeply uncomfortable with the direction of this World Cup. This is not one incident, it is not one controversy, it is not one misunderstanding, it is a sequence, and sequences matter, because football history is rarely changed by a single event. It changes when separate events begin pointing in the same direction. That is exactly what is happening now. Over the past months, disputes surrounding ticket allocations, supporter complaints, travel concerns, governance disagreements, and public criticism of FIFA's management have steadily accumulated. Individually, each issue looked manageable. Collectively, they have created something much more serious, a crisis of confidence. And confidence is the most valuable currency any governing body possesses. The World Cup was supposed to demonstrate FIFA's global leadership. Instead, it has increasingly become a test of its credibility, because the questions are no longer coming only from journalists. They are no longer coming only from social media. They are increasingly coming from institutions, from federations, from supporter organizations, from football officials. And when institutions begin asking difficult questions, the pressure changes completely, because institutions possess memory, they possess influence. And perhaps most importantly, they possess alternatives. That is why Europe's response matters, because what we are witnessing is not necessarily a coordinated rebellion. No official declaration has been issued, no alliance has been announced, no federation has publicly declared war on FIFA. And yet, different organizations in different countries, through entirely different processes, continue arriving at remarkably similar conclusions. Something is wrong, something is broken. And something about this World Cup has left a growing number of football institutions profoundly uneasy. That is why people have begun using a dramatic phrase: Europe revolts. Now, perhaps revolt sounds too dramatic, perhaps it sounds exaggerated, but think about what has happened. Supporter groups have launched formal complaints. Senior officials have publicly expressed concerns. Reports of governance disputes have continued to emerge. Institutional disagreements that once happened behind closed doors have increasingly become public. And perhaps most significantly, symbolic acts have begun replacing diplomatic language. Because in football, symbols matter. Sometimes more than statements, sometimes more than press conferences, sometimes more than official communiques. A symbolic action can communicate an entire argument without saying a single word. That is exactly why recent events have resonated so strongly, because they are not simply administrative decisions. They are institutional signals, signals that trust is under pressure, signals that patience may be running thin. Signals that a growing number of people within football's power structure believe the game is moving in an uncomfortable direction. The real issue is not whether FIFA has made mistakes. Every governing body makes mistakes. The real issue is whether those mistakes are beginning to form a pattern. Patterns change perceptions, and perceptions change legitimacy. For years, FIFA has presented itself as the guardian of world football. The organization capable of bringing together every confederation, every federation, every culture, and every supporter under one global tournament. That vision is powerful. It is inspiring. And in many ways, it has transformed football. But visions are tested during difficult moments, not during celebrations, not during opening ceremonies, not during trophy presentations. Difficult moments reveal whether institutions truly embody the values they promote. And the 2026 World Cup has produced a remarkable number of difficult moments. The consequence is now visible. Europe is increasingly asking uncomfortable questions. Who is accountable? Who is responsible? Who protects the principles football claims to hold? And perhaps most importantly, who decides what football's values actually are? Because football's authority does not exist only in one building. It exists across confederations, across clubs, across supporters, across federations, across millions of people who collectively give the game its meaning. This is why the current tensions feel so significant. The disagreements are no longer simply about administration. They are becoming philosophical. Different institutions increasingly appear to have different visions of what global football governance should look like. And when that happens, every controversy suddenly becomes much larger. Every incident becomes symbolic. Every statement carries additional meaning. Every institutional action becomes a message. This is where the phrase "Europe revolts" becomes more than a headline. It becomes a description of a mood of frustration, a mood of skepticism, a mood of growing discomfort, and moods inside institutions matter. Because institutions rarely change direction overnight, they evolve gradually, through discussions, through disagreements, through symbolic gestures. Through moments when people inside those institutions decide that silence is no longer sufficient. The most fascinating part of this story is that nobody appears to be acting entirely together. There is no single leader, no single movement, no central command, and yet the signals keep appearing, again and again and again, different organizations independently reaching similar conclusions. That is what gives this story its weight. Because when multiple institutions begin expressing similar concerns through different actions, it becomes increasingly difficult to dismiss those concerns as isolated complaints. This is no longer one disagreement. It is an atmosphere, and atmospheres can shape history. Football has experienced institutional crises before, power struggles before, governance disputes before. But World Cups are supposed to transcend those arguments. They are supposed to become moments of unity, moments when the sports divisions temporarily disappear. That is what makes this tournament so unusual, because the debates have not disappeared, they have intensified. The football itself remains extraordinary, the players remain extraordinary, the supporters remain extraordinary, but surrounding the tournament is an entirely different conversation, a conversation about governance, a conversation about trust, a conversation about credibility, and those conversations do not end when the final whistle blows. They often define how history remembers entire tournaments. Years from now, people will remember who won the World Cup, but they may also remember something else. They may remember that this was the tournament that forced football to ask difficult questions about itself, questions that many institutions appeared unwilling to ignore. Questions that became impossible to dismiss. Questions that produced visible cracks between different centers of power within the game. That is the true significance of what we are seeing. Not merely criticism, not merely controversy, but the emergence of competing visions of how football should be governed. Because every institution involved in world football claims to act in the interests of the game, the problem begins when they disagree on what those interests actually are. That disagreement now appears increasingly visible, and the consequences may extend far beyond this tournament, because trust, once weakened, is difficult to rebuild. Authority, once questioned, is difficult to restore, and credibility, once challenged by multiple institutions at the same time, becomes one of the hardest things in the world to defend. This is why the coming weeks matter so much. Every decision, every statement, every disagreement, every gesture, every symbolic act, all of it will become part of football history. Will this World Cup ultimately be remembered as a tournament that expanded the game's global reach? Or will it be remembered as the moment when deep divisions inside football's governance became impossible to hide? We do not yet know. History is still being writ. But one thing appears increasingly clear. The story of the 2026 World Cup is no longer only about football. It is also about institutions, about authority, about values, about trust. and about whether the organizations that govern the game still command the confidence they once did. Football at this scale is never just a tournament, it is a mirror. And right now, that mirror is reflecting something uncomfortable. A sport asking difficult questions about itself, institutions struggling to define their responsibilities, and a growing number of people across football refusing to pretend that everything is normal. What do you think? Is Europe genuinely defending the principles it believes football should represent? Or are we witnessing a power struggle that has simply become too public to conceal? Because one thing is certain. The 2026 World Cup has become more than a competition, it has become a test. And history will decide who